ready.
Good. All right. Hello, welcome. Today we have Steve Hanna here, who wrote Dairylandia, Dispatches from a State of Mind. I'm going to start off the the bio from the back of his book so you can know a little bit about him. Steve Hanna spent almost 2 decades as a pretty good reporter, sometime columnist and managing editor at the Milwaukee Journal. He then devoted 12 years of his life to writing a syndicated column called State of Mind. The last 10 years of his career were spent as a CEO of The Onion, America's finest news source. He once spent a winter night in northern Wisconsin with a guy who invented a contraption that would take the whole shell off a hard-boiled egg by employing an electrifying two-handed thrust that resembled the Heimlich maneuver. While the experience didn't exactly change his life, it was a lot more interesting than covering the state legislature. He divides his time these days between his home on the Wisconsin River in Sauk County and Austin, Texas. Thanks for being here.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be anywhere these days, right?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
So, okay, how about you start us off with a little bit more about yourself and how you ended up in Wisconsin so we can make sense of these stories you wrote and are going to expound on tonight.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm absolutely an East Coast guy, and I couldn't find Wisconsin on a map actually before I got here. It's one of the 50 states. It was probably number 49 in places I was going to visit. I knew nothing about it, and I went to, as I was telling my close friends in the front row, I went to college and graduate school in Dublin, Ireland. And when I came back, I had a girlfriend in Los Angeles, and I told my parents, I'm just going to go to LA. I'm going to hit the big time. And I got all the way to Chicago hitchhiking, and I had a friend in Chicago, and he said, you want to meet my fiance and we'll go out to dinner? And do you mind if she brings her roommate? And I said, I don't care. She can bring her entire family for all I care. I'm leaving tomorrow. And anyway, she was from this mysterious place called Wisconsin. And so I ended up coming up to Wisconsin. I thought I'd just have a look around and then go to LA. And that was 43 years ago. That was 43 years ago and 2 wives. Sorry. So I've stayed in Wisconsin, and I just thought it was magical. I thought it was a beautiful place. I grew up really in a lovely town outside of New York City, but it was not like driving up here on Highway 13 today. It was, and Wisconsin, is not exactly New Jersey. New Jersey's the most congested state in the union, and I lived not far from lots of environmental dumps and factories and things like that. So when I got here, I was just gobsmacked at the beauty of it, and also a very different kind of people, than I was accustomed to growing up.
On that same line of thought, why did you choose to write Dairylandia instead of the ostensibly more entertaining and profitable book about your time at The Onion? In essence, what made you love all things Wisconsin so much?
Well, I think part of it is that I am not descended from people like John Muir or Aldo Leopold, but I absolutely fell in love with the landscape. I mean, I live right on Lake Wisconsin, which is the dammed up portion of the river. And that's the first place. And I'm down near Devil's Lake. Do you guys know Devil's Lake? So I'm only about 5-6 miles from Devil's Lake. And I'd never seen anything quite like that. In New Jersey, we have, people identify themselves by which exit on the Garden State Parkway. So when they see somebody, they'd say, where are you from? And they'd say, 76. But in Wisconsin, all these places had a very distinct feel. And I loved the beauty. And then I eventually got a job with the Milwaukee Journal. I desperately needed a job. I was running out of money. I was married. And they offered me a job as the farm reporter. And yeah, that's what I said. No, actually, I said, how much does it pay? And I said, look, I don't know the front end. I worked in the supermarket in high school, and I know where the dairy cooler is, but other than that, I don't know the front end from the back end of a cow. And but I said, how much does it pay? And they said $13,000 a year. And I said, I'm your guy. I mean, this is the job I've always wanted. And I ended up for the first 5 or 6 years at the Journal, covering agriculture, and they called it state affairs, which meant that if something happened in Wisconsin Rapids at a paper mill, or there was an accident, or as Colin knows, having read the book, mass murder and up near Shatek, or farmers dumping milk, or whatever the state story was, I was usually dispatched. So I traveled around the state, and the more I saw of it, the more I liked it, and lo and behold, I got to be pretty comfortable here, and people were decent.
Awesome. And so taking that, you wanted to write this book, Dairylandia, instead of About the Onion. How'd that go?
Oh, well, that, so I went on to the Onion, which I'll talk about later if you would like me to. And, and at the Onion, we sold the company in 2016. And when I was leaving, I had some friends who were real book writers. And I'd written columns for years. I'd written thousands of articles in magazines and things like that. Although at the Onion, I was the CEO of the company. So, I mean, I guess it seemed logical that I would write a book about the Onion, because the Onion was, to answer one of your questions, the Onion ended up as a force online, not only in the United States, but internationally. So we had 35 million page views. That means 35 million times a month, someone would come to the Onion and read something. So we had this huge audience. I wanted to write about Wisconsin because I was tired of the Onion. After those years, we'd sold the company. It was a wonderful experience. So, but I wanted to write about Wisconsin and all these different people I'd met and these adventures I had. And so, to make a long story short, these two friends of mine, one is Scott Simon. Is anybody here a NPR listener at all? Scott Simon is the host of All Things Considered on weekends. And another, Jonathan Eig, is a writer who's written 5 or 6 New York Times bestsellers. And they both said, these guys really want to talk to you, these agents in New York, so go to New York and talk to them. And they really want to publish your book. And I went there and they said, man, this is a great time to write about the Onion. I mean, the political climate being what it is. And I said, well, actually, I'm gonna write a book about Wisconsin, which is kind of my adopted state, and these very interesting people I met and adventures I had. Everything from, spending time with the world's greatest bratwurst sausage eating winner to writing. There's a chapter in the book about Jerry Boyle, who was a good friend of mine, who was Jeffrey Dahmer's lawyer. And so I was involved in managing the coverage of Dahmer when I was at the Milwaukee Journal. So for 2 years of my life, it was all Dahmer all the time. But I wanted to write these stories. And these agents in New York said, you're out of your mind. Wisconsin? He said, the Onion is famous. But they said, we don't want to hurt your feelings. And I said, I don't think you're going to hurt my feelings. They said, but you're not famous. So why would it? And plus, Wisconsin. Who wants to read a book about Wisconsin? I said, well, I don't know, but I want to write a book about Wisconsin. And they said, when you come to your senses, come back and we'll get you a big advance. But this is the dumbest idea you've ever had, probably. And I said, no, I've had dumber ideas than this. So I wanted to write these stories. And truthfully, as long as this is an intimate crowd, I really wanted to. I was on the road so much for so many years when my children were growing up that I wanted them to. Although I'm close to my kids, and they both live in Austin, Texas, where I live half the year. And but I had this vision that one day their kids would go by the bookshelf and they'd say, "Well, isn't that our grandfather?" And they'd be able to read the book and know these adventures I had and how I developed this, love for Wisconsin, frankly. I'm happy. It's the best state in the union. So that's why I did it. I passed up the money, Colin. Yeah.
Are you ever going to cash in on that money?
Well, I've actually done about 30 chapters, so I may, but I have another book that I'm working on before that. And I actually brought a little piece of it today that I thought it might be fun to test on our audience.
Definitely.
So someday I'll probably do something, because the Onion, maybe we can talk about this at the end. The Onion I can tell you a few stories about, run-ins I had with Michael Cohen, Donald Trump's lawyer, and George W. Bush, who sued us. All kinds of exciting, interesting things. And the Onion is, we lived to fool people, and we fooled people, and sometimes they were in very high places, and they don't like to be fooled.
Yep, I saw a lot of those articles that fooled people that were getting passed around, but like, oh, wait a minute, this is not real.
No. I'll be happy maybe after we talk about the book a little bit to tell you a story or two.
The book is listed as a travel book. Just won a gold medal at the Midwest Book Awards for travel writing.
Yep.
How about a travel recommendation? What do we need to experience in Wisconsin? And why is it considered a travel book?
I have no idea why it's considered a travel book at all. They have the Midwest Book Awards are held every year. And one day the people who are in charge of publicity at the University of Wisconsin Press, they published the book, called and said, "We've entered your book in the Midwest Book Awards." I said, "Great." And I had no idea what, I was busy working on another book. And then all of a sudden one day I got a call and they said, "You won the gold medal." And I said, "Terrific. I mean, I'm the overall winner." And they said, "Oh, no, you're not the overall." They said, "We don't have an overall winner, but you won in the travel category." And I said, "Well, I've read a lot of travel books, and this is a book mainly about people." But they said, "Yeah, but these people all live in different places." And I said, "That's it? That's your rationale?" And they said, "Yes." And I said, "Okay, well, in that case, I graciously accept the gold medal." But I would recommend, I love the Wisconsin River. I'd start at Vieux des Airs, the headwaters, and go all the way down to the Mississippi. I love the driftless region of Wisconsin.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, it's absolutely gorgeous. I love the Kettle Moraine. I was there last week. North and west of Milwaukee. I like Lake Michigan. I'm going to Bayfield this weekend with my wife. It's just beautiful this time of year. I think this state is just blessed with extraordinary physical beauty. It takes my breath away.
So let's see. On page 59,
you really did your homework here. Okay.
After Earhart died, Katie stayed in the old yellow farmhouse, but spent winters with her 2 daughters in Hawaii. "We loved having her here," Barb said. "We wanted her to move here permanently, but she wouldn't. Her heart was in Wisconsin."
Yes.
So I'm wondering, did you ever leave Wisconsin for an extended period of time and feel the call to come back, or rediscovered the beauty and atmosphere that becomes commonplace when living here? Katie Schultz, she moved to Hawaii. I think
no, she wouldn't.
I may pick Hawaii. I don't know. But I did spend a summer in Yellowstone, and when I came back to Wisconsin, it did feel good. It felt like a moisture-filled dome. It was like green and vibrant compared to all the dry of Yellowstone.
Yeah.
So it was something that I took for granted that I didn't really notice until I was away for like 3 months.
Yeah. Well, I did live. I've lived in a bunch of places even before I arrived here. I lived in New York City, and I lived in L.A. And I lived in Chicago for quite a while. And then my professional life was spent at the Milwaukee Journal, and then I had a 10-year. I was a columnist there and a writer, and eventually I was the managing editor and then the executive editor. So I ran the Milwaukee Journal for a bunch of years. But then I got an offer from a friend of mine who said, "This newspaper business is not a good business." He said, "It's going to go downhill." I said, "Really? I think we're doing pretty well." And he was in the investment business, and I was running a newsroom. This shocks me today to think about it. We had 350 people in the Milwaukee Journal newsroom. We had 75 or 80 reporters, and we had 40 photographers and graphic artists and copy editors and everybody else. So, although I spent that time in Wisconsin, and actually I moved to Milwaukee to work for this investment company, which was a good experience for me in many ways. It taught me a little bit about money. That was a good thing I wasn't very interested in, and I got more interested in it over time. And the business of how you make money, frankly, it was fascinating. And I started off thinking that these people were really unimaginative, They were sort of money clerks, Barnaby the Scrivener, counting money, Silas Marner, and they turned out to be some of the most imaginative people I'd ever met. I mean, they saw things that I'd go on road trips with investment managers, and they'd say, "What did you see?" We were at Corning Glass, and I would say, "I see a company that made Corningware, and it's they're really struggling." And I said, "What did you see?" And he said, "I see a company that's perfectly set up to produce fiber optic cable." And he said, "So I'm going to buy 1 million shares of this." These guys, we had $60 billion under management, billion with a B. And so he bought it at $8 a share. And when it got to 80, he sold half his position. So anyway, this was entirely different world for me. And then, so I traveled. I was in New York every single week for years, or Washington, or LA a lot, all over the country. And I flew Midwest Express out of Milwaukee every week, every Monday. Another good reason to write a book about Wisconsin that your kids can read, because they wondered, like, where's the old man today? So that kind of told them. And then I when we bought the Onion, I went back to Madison, and we ran it there, but it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And we were doing so much work on the East Coast. In New York, we had a big office in New York, and we were doing a lot of television work in LA. And so it made a lot of sense to move everything to Chicago, although my staff didn't think that made a lot of sense. The people in New York, many of whom, the kids who started the Onion at Madison were from Wisconsin, small towns around Wisconsin. One of our really brilliant comedy writers was from Wisconsin Rapids. His name was Todd Hansen, and his dad was a Lutheran minister here. And so Todd was here, and Carol Kolb, who wrote for many years, I don't know what she's doing today, but she wrote for many years for Modern Family. After I announced we were moving from New York, not a popular decision, but made sense. Carol went to LA, and she was the head writer on Modern Family. Will Tracy was the head writer on John Oliver Show, the director and executive producer of Colbert. Colbert has 5 of our writers. So I spent a lot of time in New York and all those places, and I like nothing more than to wake up in Manhattan early on when I finished my work, and I could go to LaGuardia Airport in 15 minutes at 5 o'clock, and there was a 6 o'clock flight from LaGuardia rather, to Milwaukee, and I would get to Milwaukee at 6, and I lived in Whitefish Bay at the time, and rather than go there, I would get in my car and drive out to my place on Lake Wisconsin. So you'd be in Midtown Manhattan all week, and you could just feel your blood pressure drop about 100 points. So there was this magnetic pull for Wisconsin for me. I never really thought about living anyplace else, and when I wasn't here, I missed it. I sound like such a homer, and I am.
Speaking more about the beauty, and you did mention Muir earlier, there's this one sentence here I highlighted as an amazing sentence. Let me read this here. A few afternoons every autumn, almost always during the cool, crisp days of October, when the gentle green hills across the Wisconsin River are a riot of red and gold, I take a walk along the wooded trail that hugs the shoreline at Sauk City. That sentence jumped out at me, and I was wondering, did you ever get into any nature writers to sharpen your skills, such as Muir or Thoreau? Did you write about, you did write about a character, Ken Lang, who was fond of Thoreau, and you used this fine quote from Mr. Henry David Thoreau: "An early morning walk is a blessing for the whole day." So what, did they inspire you at all, or what inspires you to hone your writing craft?
Well, I mean, to answer your first question, I've read all of those people. I'd never heard of John Muir before I arrived in Wisconsin, and a good friend of mine in Madison said, if you're going to learn about Wisconsin and the devotion that people have to the environment here and to the rivers and lakes and streams and parks, and I was living near Devil's Lake at that time, and it's just a beautiful place. So I read Muir, and I read Aldo Leopold, Sand County Almanac, because he lived not far from where I live. And also, I'm trying to remember Ben, the guy who wrote The Land Remembers. Yeah, he's from the Driftless region.
Yeah, I know.
It's a wonderful book. So, and honestly, I wish I could say that, Thoreau inspired me, but I did read Thoreau's works, but just driving around Wisconsin was enough to inspire me, honestly. And after a while, you don't feel self-conscious about bragging about the state you live in. I've mentioned the story in the room. My mother was a librarian, and she couldn't understand what I was doing out here. She thought, well, he's just having this mild flirtation. I was married too, but this mild flirtation with this place called Wisconsin, which she couldn't find on a map. And when she'd come out and visit, she'd always say, "Are you ready to come home?" I said, "To where, New Jersey?" And she'd say, "Yeah, that's your home." And I said, "No, really, Wisconsin's my home." And she said, "How can you live in a place that only has mediocre cable?" And that was her sort of threshold for whether or not a place was civilized. She said, "The cable's okay, but it's not really good cable. How a person lives without good cable, it's beyond me. And so you'll come home eventually." And I said, "I don't think so, Mom." So,
So who are some of your favorite writers, just all around?
Ooh,
I know you're an English major and you're writing for a living.
yeah. Oh, I got a letter from my daughter today, an email rather. She and my son are in business together. They buy houses and rehab them, and then Austin is a real tourist town, or at least it was pre-COVID. So they're rehabbing these houses, and they're putting books in the houses. So my daughter sent me a note this afternoon, and I didn't answer. But I started out wanting to be a writer because my mother was a writer. She was a librarian, but she wrote poetry, and she was a voracious reader too. So you cannot be. This is a unsolicited offering. You can't be a writer and not be a reader. And I defy you to find any writer, whether it's someone as modestly talented as I am to someone who's very, very talented. And those people are reading all the time. I was really impacted when I was a kid by reading. I remember the first book that really kind of blew me away was To Kill a Mockingbird. I just thought it was the most extraordinary book. Then I started to read Hemingway. And I thought I was at that time showing off all the time in school because I was a pretty good writer, for a high school kid. But, I'd be trying to pad it with the largest $75 words I could find, and spending most of my time with the thesaurus. And then I read Hemingway, and there's this really simple, I think the word they always use is economical sentences, and the stories were, anybody could read them. But then since then, I've read, Mark Twain is, I suppose, the greatest influence on me of any writer. I think he's the most brilliant comic writer and satirist, and that fit in very well with my work in the comedy business at The Onion. My daughter asked me, "Give me 2 books that you've read in recent years that you just loved," and the first one I gave her was a book that won the Pulitzer a year ago called Say Nothing, which is a story about the aftermath of the people who, they call them the disappeared, people who disappeared in Northern Ireland and were never found. Either the Catholics or the Protestants took them and murdered them, and that became a big issue when the Easter Accords that Bill Clinton engineered in the late 90s. So Say Nothing is a wonderful book. And I have to say, I wanted to read for years a book by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, or is it Gabriel Marquez Garcia? He's the only South American writer ever to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. And he wrote a book that is called Love in the Time of Cholera. And I would say if you're a reader, I've never read anything like it in my life. But, Fitzgerald and Hemingway and Sinclair Lewis, I read all those classics originally, the Odyssey, the Iliad, and
Yeah, my wife likes that Love in the Time of Cholera book, I believe, but I have not read it yet.
It takes a commitment. I also read a lot of, I don't want anybody here to think that I'm terribly highbrow. You probably don't already. But I read a lot of espionage stuff. My favorites there are read John le Carre forever, and le Carre's got, I don't know, 30 or 40 books, and I've read Daniel Silver for the last 10 years. I read everything that he writes. These guys are not just really good spy novelists; they're wonderful writers, and I think le Carre is one of the great writers of my lifetime, certainly. So I do read, yes.
Yes. Speaking more about writing, there's a lot of talk of journalists that you held in high regard in the book. Would you still choose to become a journalist if you're starting out in 2020? How has the landscape kind of changed?
Well, I mean, you know as well as I do that I think since 2004, I read this recently, 2,000 newspapers have disappeared. And I think that's tragic. And the ones that are left, I don't know what the Daily Tribune's like here, but the newspaper that that's exactly, I worked for the Milwaukee Journal when it was that big. And when we had our Sunday circulation was 1 million copies and 2.5 people read every single copy. So we had 2.5 million people, and Wisconsin had 5 million. So half the state read the Milwaukee Journal on Sunday. And when I would travel all over the state, I could be in Superior, Kenosha, wherever I was, the Journal, one edition. We had 7 editions every single day. So we were redoing the paper for rural Wisconsin, the city of Milwaukee, the suburbs, separate edition for Madison, separate edition for the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. There's nothing like it anymore. I mean, in short, I choose to be a writer for sure, but journalism is a really hard way to make a living, and there's just not much of it left. You and I were talking just prior to starting about the Daily Tribune, and everybody's just now, Gannett owns all the newspapers in Wisconsin, and they're owned by a private equity firm in Rochester, New York. So very tough way to make a living. But, this book, the beating heart of this book is people I met as a journalist, really, I came across. And so it's a wonderful experience. I just think it'd be really hard to repeat it today. It's a much different market. There just aren't jobs. There's the internet, but anybody can pretend they're a journalist on the internet. And that's why the internet is a wonderful technological creation, and also it's a threat to civilization. There's so much disinformation and misinformation on it that you never know what to believe. And when I was at the Milwaukee Journal and I was a cub reporter, if you didn't interview both sides of every story, regardless of whether you liked them or agreed with them, if you came back and turned in a story to the city desk and you had a point of view in there, and you had not dealt with all the relevant personalities who should have had their say, you do that 2 or 3 times, you'd be out of work. The idea was to play it. Everyone has their preferences, but the idea and certainly the mission of the newspaper was to play it up the middle. And that's how you got credibility. You confined your opinions to the editorial page, not to the news columns. So that's a long-winded way of answering your question. I'd be a writer for sure,
Yeah, it's tough nowadays. You got to read a lot to figure out the actual essence of the story.
And there just aren't that many places really to go to work. Even, Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post because he's got more money than God, and he spent $250 million for a dying property. And the New York Times seems to be actually growing its subscriptions. They say they are. I really doubt it, to be honest. I subscribe to the New York Times every day, and I pay peanuts for this, So other digital subscriptions, they allegedly have 450,000 of them. That's not like, Google and Facebook have siphoned off all the advertising. That's where all the money went. And we did really well as a digital company at The Onion. First of all, we did really well at the Milwaukee Journal. We had this huge machine. We made no money Monday through Saturday. And on Sunday, we made a boatload of money. And nobody's here to call me on it, so I'll be totally indiscreet. We used to make, just at the newspapers, we used to make $400 million a year. That was our revenues. And the EBITDA, or our profits, were about $250 million. So it was enormously profitable. And if it was the Boston store or Macy's or Harley Davidson in Milwaukee, you had to, or car dealers, you had to opt to advertise with the Journal. And then all of a sudden that changed with the coming of digital. And we did really well competitively because we had a very different, unique kind of offering. We also had at the Onion a really young audience and highly educated audience, and hence an affluent audience. And so we were able to do a lot of good advertising deals until Google and Facebook really grew, and then they started taking our money away. And I'd like to say I saw it all coming. I experienced some of it, but we had a good offer to sell at the right time. So there you go.
Yeah. There's a story that has a connection to Wisconsin Rapids in the book, and I was wondering if you could do a reading of that one for us.
Yeah, I wish it were a little more. These folks all seem to be able to take this. I used to get up here to Rapids, and a good friend of mine, Tom Enright. I don't know if you ever knew Tom. So Tom lives not 5 miles from me now in Sauk City, works in Madison. But I worked with Tom, and I think Tom is the one who tipped me off, and he sent me like a paragraph from the paper that was about a woman who, I'm glad she's not here tonight, Della Dobby was her name. And this I'll put aside. Let me see if I can find what I did with this. Anyway, she was a very industrious, clever woman. And she, is that a good way to put it?
Yeah.
So I wrote a chapter about her in this, and it was just a story that really struck my fancy when I was writing my State of Mind column for 12 years, which was a syndicated column around the Midwest. So the title of the chapter is Nearly Naked Seeking Snow in Wisconsin, That's Amore. Love. And I started off by saying, Wisconsin men, a macho lot who wear only the finest in camouflage clothing and prefer their bratwurst boiled in beer, have done some really dumb things in the name of love or lust or a combination thereof. But in their defense, who hasn't? Until I became acquainted with the seductive ways of the Snow Queen, I thought the role of the Wisconsin Wayward Lovers Hall of Fame would be led by the late David Kritzik and the very much living Dominic Guglielmo. But today the top of the charts would be threatened by Mr. Z and Mr. M, two terribly amorous gents who apparently lost their hearts, not to mention their pants, to the wicked ways of Miss Della Dobby, a.k.a. the Snow Queen. You remember Mr. Kritzik. He was a multimillionaire industrialist from Milwaukee who, in his late 70s, took up with two sisters, Lynette Harris and Leanne Conley, twins. The twins, many decades younger than their shared boyfriend, had twice appeared in the All Together and Together in Playboy magazine. So smitten was Mr. Kritzik with their collective charms that he favored them with cash, furs, and homes worth millions of dollars. Sadly, and I personally believe misguidedly, even though the twins later sued me for casting asparagus on their good names, which is true, they did sue me, the United States government indicted Lynette and Leanne, saying that they failed to pay taxes on all those nice payments and gifts below by Mr. Kritzik. Both were found guilty in federal court, but the convictions were later overturned because, in a nutshell, the twins just weren't all that familiar with the nuances of the federal tax code. Score one for the concept of human kindness and generosity. Likewise, Nick Guglielmo was the love-struck lad, also from Milwaukee, who helped convicted murderer Laurencia Bembenek. Does anybody remember Laurencia Bembenek? Yeah. Laurencia Bembenek escaped from prison. Eventually, the lovers were captured in Thunder Bay, Ontario. For his undying love and devotion, Nick was sentenced to 24 months in jail and ordered to pay $2,500 in extradition costs. As God is my witness, Nick swore at sentencing, if Laurencia Bembenek came in here now and asked me to help her escape, I would say no. Ah, Nicky, we are too soon suckered, too late wised up. Meanwhile, in retrospect, Mr. Kritzik and Mr. Nick look like very savvy customers compared with Mr. Z and Mr. M. I don't have the heart to use their names. Of Snow Queen fame. The Snow Queen, as the cops call her, is actually a lady named Della Dobby of the little Wisconsin hamlet of, is it Rushalt?
Rushalt.
Rushalt. She was charged in Stevens Point with several counts of theft. According to the police report, on successive winter nights, she managed to relieve Mr. Z and Mr. M of their clothing and cash in a most ingenious way. To wit, one cold night in early March, Mr. M was shooting pool at a tavern when Ms. Dobby arrived. After a few drinks, they decided to step out and visit another tavern. En route in his Ford Bronco, she suggested they park for a bit. That sounded very good to Mr. M. As kind of an extra special treat, she suggested that Mr. M, soon clad only in his boxers, get out of the truck, gather some snow, bring it back, and let her rub it all over him. Perrin, this is what's known in certain parts of northern Wisconsin as foreplay. Mr. M, obviously nobody's fool, later told the cops that he didn't think this was such a great idea. Nonetheless, he took off his pants and did what he was told. As soon as I stepped out of the vehicle, real Wisconsinmen always say vehicle. They never say car or truck. She was gone, Mr. M told the cops. Along with the Snow Queen went the man's personal possessions, and the miserable Mr. M was left shivering in his shorts. At the local cop shop, Mr. M was shown a bunch of mugshots. Again, according to the police complaint on file, he picked out Miss Della Dobby immediately, and with the sort of conviction that comes with losing your pants while standing in 2 feet of snow, he pointed her a picture and said, "I'd never forget that face." Things didn't go any smoother for Mr. Z the very next night. He was having a drink at a bar in the city of Wisconsin Rapids, a bar appropriately called Fritters. Anybody been there? Yeah, you wouldn't admit it anyway. When an attractive woman walked in, and he bought her a drink. Pretty soon they agreed to take off for a casino down the road. Eventually, because this sort of Northwoods tavern love is so intoxicating, they decided to share a motel. On the way to the motel, you guessed it, the Snow Queen, being a frugal type of lady, said they could save some money if they skipped the motel and got to know each other in the cab of the truck. Once again, decked out only in his skivvies, she told Mr. Z to go and gather snow. "But I don't see any snow nearby," said the befuddled Mr. Z. "Over there by the stump, you silly goose," said the Snow Queen, and off into the woods went Mr. Z. Then, as the criminal complaint charged and quoted our pants-down pal, away she went. Although the charges against Miss Dobby are misdemeanors, she each carries a possible $10,000 fine and 9 months in jail. Ordinarily, as a law-abiding citizen who has never lost his pants, this is me now, while shoveling snow in his underwear close to a tree stump, I would say let the punishment fit the crime. But in this case, assuming these two brainiacs really did lose their minds and their pants in the manner alleged, I believe that throwing the book at the Snow Queen would be a miscarriage of justice. Because I believe that any woman who can persuade two fully grown, however romantically challenged Wisconsin guys to get out of a truck on a frigid winter night, clad only in their skivvies, and rub snow on themselves or haul it back to a truck in hopes that the Snow Queen will turn them into lovable little snowmen, deserves neither a fine nor a jail cell. She deserves an Oscar. So that was a Wisconsin Rapids story. There were many over the years. I wrote the column for the local paper here for 12 years. That was one of the papers in the syndicate.
There's in that story, you talk about getting sued, and a couple other times tonight too. How many times did you get sued?
Oh, I don't know. A lot of times.
How does that go?
Well, it was a much more arduous process when you got sued at the Milwaukee Journal, because people had they had lawyers, and they had the libel laws are written in such a way in Wisconsin where, you have a burden to prove that you actually had the facts straight and you didn't impugn these people's good names or their reputations. So the burden of proof is really on the defendant in those cases. Whereas at the Onion, there's this broad First Amendment protection for satire. So, I'll give you I get sued in Milwaukee frequently, and occasionally we went to court. Occasionally we settled, and sometimes we just said we called their bluff and they went away. But we did pay some money over the years for doing things that were, sloppy and hurt people's reputations. So I was part of that. Of course, when you're putting out 7 editions a day, this sounds like an excuse. We got sued one time justifiably because we did something when we had deadlines, and we were right on deadline. We held the press for 15 minutes, jammed a story in about a guy who was arrested he was a pedophile. He'd gone to prison. His parole officer, when he came up for release, said, "Don't let this guy out," told the judge. The judge said, "I'm going to let him out." Let him out, and by the next day, he had already violated a bunch of kids. And my staff came running into my office, excuse me, and said, "We've got the story." The judge said, "We got to let him out." And the parole officer and everybody else said, "Don't let this guy out. He will go after young kids again." And, that was a pretty outrageous story. And so we went to the library. We had this voluminous library of photos, and the guy's name was Alan Radke, and it was spelled Ratke, Radke. And we went and picked a picture out of a guy named Alan Radke, Radtke, who was running for the school board in West Bend. And we ran his picture on the front page of the paper saying, "Here's a pedophile who struck again." And it was a terrible event. And it dragged on. And very unfortunately, 6 months after, so I became the kind of bad guy in this, although, it was my call. I hadn't written the story, but I was responsible. And 6 months later, I got a call from his wife one day, and she said, "Do you remember me?" And I said, "Of course." I'd called him and called her and apologized. And then I did all the other procedural things you do to avoid punitive and actual damages. There's a way you have to do that in the papers. And she called me and said, "I just wanted you to know that my husband was killed this afternoon. He was T-boned coming home from work. He was a school teacher, and he died. And I just want you to know that there wasn't a day in his life in the last 6 months in which he didn't think about what happened to him at the hands of the Milwaukee Journal." And I said, I apologized again and said how sorry I was that he had died. There's always these stories aren't quite as pure as they seem. About 24 hours later, I got a pitch from her lawyer for a lot of money. And we were not involved in that crash or anything. But so now it became a legal matter where they were trying to basically extort money from us. And it was my job at the time to say, "No, I'm really sorry about your husband. I'm sorry about what we did, but we were not involved in that crash, and we don't owe you money. I'm sorry." And, now I'm 70 years old, and if I had to do over again, probably would have written her a check. But at the time, that was really not an option that I chose. That really went all over the place.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah. The White House sued us one day. We used to have, you remember the Saturday president's annual broadcast? All the presidents on Saturday would have a radio broadcast. They'd do a little broadcast. You'd listen to it on the radio. And we had a little, this was part of our webpage, and we had a guy who was a terrific mime, and he could do Clinton, he could do Bush, he could do Reagan, he could do them all. And so they were extraordinarily funny. It was wonderful. We had, tens of thousands of people every Saturday who listened to it. One Saturday, I was going by the person who was laying out the page, and I said, we ought to dress this up and make it look good. We ought to take the presidential seal, just put it on there. So I did that, and then I got a letter about 2 weeks later from the head of the White House legal counsel's office who said, "Cease and desist. We're going to sue you into oblivion." And so we thought this was kind of entertaining because it's really hard to sue the Onion because you have to prove that people don't know that this is not true. And everybody, we had 35 million readers, and they all knew it wasn't true. So it's hard to get a jury. But the White House persisted, and I had this running dialogue with the Office of Legal Counsel there. Our lawyers were included, but I gave it to a guy named Scott Dickers, who was the original founder, the creative chief of the Onion. And I said, "Why don't you answer one of these letters?" And he wrote this he was from Ellsworth, Wisconsin. And he wrote, the first letter he wrote was, "Dear Mr., I think his name was Kenyon," said, "as a boy growing up in Ellsworth, Wisconsin, I had a lot of dreams, but I never once dreamt I'd ever get White House stationery. This is so cool. This guy's threatening us. He's saying, this is so cool. I want to thank you. I'm going to save this forever. And then he went on to make a bunch of suggestions like, you obviously have a lot of time on your hand and a lot of money, so why don't you just pass some laws for no taxes for comedy writers? At the time, Bush was trying to get Harriet Mier named to the Supreme Court, but she wasn't qualified. So one of his suggestions was, how about if you, he said in Wisconsin, we have this thing called the short course where farmers go in the winter to Madison and learn for 10 days how to do something entirely new. You've got a person here who's obviously unqualified. So we had this great exchange with the White House, and finally, at the end of it, they gave up. And they kept writing notes saying, I know you don't think we do, but we have a great sense of humor here, and we subscribe, and we read The Onion every week. And finally, they just couldn't take it. The New York Times ran a story, forgot to mention this, on page 1 saying the Onion sues the White House sues the Onion, rather. And it was just absurd. So we made a lot of hay out of it. It was great for us. A lot of great publicity.
Yeah, that would be great for the Onion.
Yeah. Whenever anybody did that. Trump did it to us. All kinds of people sued us. Coretta Scott King sued us. All kinds of people. And it was always good. They were never going to win. And they did it to just intimidate us usually. And we thought it was great. It made the national news every night. So it was good publicity for us.
Yeah, do you have a couple more of your crazy Onion stories that you could give us?
Yeah, we've got hundreds of them. But we once wrote a story. So you're getting the picture now that, we made a lot of stuff up. It was satirical news. Long before President Trump decided it was all fake news. We were actually doing fake news. And we once wrote a story that said it was a dateline of China. I think it was in Shanghai. And we said that a Chinese couple had 5, they had quintuplets. And this is when the one-child law was in effect in China. You could only have one child. So we said, under Chinese custom, they have to get rid of 4 of the children. So on Friday, they're going to throw them off the top of a mountain. They've decided to keep the heaviest boy, but the others have got to go. And I was inundated by people from Lutheran Social Services and Catholic Charities. They called me, my phone rang off the hook, and they said, we'll take the children. We'll take the children. Just give us the children. And, you never have the heart. You had to stay in character. So you never at the end ever said it was just a joke. But I had many of those. I had a guy who called me one day and said, my secretary came into my office and said, I got a lot of nutty calls every day. And she said, you should really take this one. This one is priceless. And so I got on the phone. It was a guy from Texas. And he said, my name is George. I'm retired. I live in Fort Worth. I live in Texas half the year, so I'm going to do my best Texas imitation. I live in Fort Worth. He said, and I read CNN every day, and I read the Dallas Morning News and the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. I'm up on the news all the time. But I just read the story on The Onion. It said that Texas is building a wall around Texas to keep Americans out. And I said, yeah, that's. He said, to keep Americans out. He said, I don't think it's a bad idea. I think we should keep as many Americans out of Texas as we can. We don't want any of those Northerners. We want no Yankees coming down here. But it's just astonishing. He said, all these things are going on. And I didn't know about it. And I follow the news. So I just said, well, one guy can't follow everything, George. And he said, well, I'll tell you what, I'm putting aside the local papers and CNN tomorrow. And from now on, he said, I read The Onion first thing every morning. I said, you're a wise man and you'll be much more entertaining at a cocktail party, I guarantee you. So I guess my favorite is just out of nowhere, our writers decided one day to write a headline that said, Kim Jong-un voted sexiest man alive, with his little bowl-headed haircut. And so we ran the story, and this happened many times. A newspaper somewhere in the world would pick it up verbatim. They didn't realize that The Onion was making things up. In this case, the Beijing Daily News picked it up and ran a front-page story. Kim Jong-un voted sexiest man alive in the United States. Great public relations coup for them. And they ran the story for 3 days, variations on it. And then they ran 55 separate pictures of Kim Jong-un inside the newspaper, till finally some brainiac approached them and said, The Onion is a satirical newspaper. This is not really they don't always tell exactly the truth. Like they make it up. And it was about 2 days later that I got a call from the Chinese embassy, and a Chinese diplomat said, "I have you figured out." And I said, "Well, I'm not that hard to figure out, but what'd you learn?" He said, "You make up news. It's sensation." And I said, "Yeah, absolutely. We do this every day." He said, "And then you charge advertisers to make money. So you make money off of this fake news." This is years before Trump ever got on this bandwagon. And I said, "Absolutely, guilty." And he said, "Well, you should be ashamed." And I said, "I am dreadfully ashamed. But my mother just can't believe I'm still doing this for a living. She thought I had a future in journalism, but that's life." And this happened in Iran. It happened in Mongolia. It happened in Hong Kong. I hate to say it, but it happened. The Chinese people were the most gullible. They believed all these things we had. We did a piece once when Neil Armstrong died and said that he had confessed on his deathbed that he had never been to the moon, that it was all shot on the sound stage in Nevada, and he just wanted to make this deathbed confession. And people, some people think that's funny, and some people think that's not that funny. So they would let me know. So it was a constant barrage of people who did not get the joke. And our motto at the Onion was "Tu stultus es." That was on the editorial page, which meant in Latin, "You are dumb." And so we believe that anybody who did something stupid was fair game for us. And so whether you were left or right or center, we couldn't have cared less. Whether you were Bill Clinton or George Bush or Barack Obama or Donald Trump, we didn't care. If you did something dumb and it was a story for us, we went after you. And it generally got picked up by the mainstream press, because the mainstream press, having been in it for many years, wanted nothing more than to be able to write what they really thought. So we often wrote what we really thought. Our editor at the time was from Spencer, Wisconsin, and she's still a brilliant comedy writer. So,
yeah. There's so many stories in here I would like you to talk about. There were a couple that I wanted you to read, but were a little too long. The one with the Seinfeld references was really good. Is there anything that you could leave us with in parting that we haven't touched on?
I wrote a story about. I wrote a lot of stories over the years in the column about animals. And I wrote a lot of stories about people. And it occurred to me, because I was a slow learner, that after 5 years, I figured out you could write the most dramatic story about a human being ever. A guy who was stuck on the top of Mount Everest and left for dead, which I did. And you could tell this whole story, extraordinary personal story, and the next week you'd get 2 letters, out of 500,000 people who read the column. But if you wrote a story about a cat or a dog or a horse or a llama, you got inundated with mail. People absolutely loved it. So there's a story that I wrote, and it's in the book. There's a section in the book that I think it's called
Animals, yes. People, not so much.
People, not so much, yeah. So I was struggling for a column one day, and my wife walked in and said, I had about 3 hours to go, and I had nothing on the page, that's alarming when you got 25 newspapers waiting for you to file in at noon. And she said, we had a cat, and the cat had died. She said, "Why don't you write about Bo?" The cat's name was Bo. So I wrote this. This is the chapter from the book. It's, I think, mercifully short. And the title of the chapter was Bo Knows. If you remember the old Bo
Jackson.
Bo Jackson, yeah. The whole Nike ad, Bo Knows. We had a hobby farm in Ozaukee County that we sold last year. It had 5 outbuildings, including 2 barns. When we moved in, we discovered an old ragamuffin cat living in a cardboard box upstairs in the small white barn. The kids named him Bo. He proceeded to run the place, not just the barn, but the entire 10-acre hobby farm, including our house, until the day his kidneys finally quit. On the spur of the moment, motivated by the fact that I didn't have a column one Friday, I decided to devote the space to old Bo. It took me 45 minutes to compose, and nothing I have wrote before or since 650 columns ever elicited such a response. And it went like this. Bo had an attitude. Our first summer on the farm, the dog next door came loping across the pasture and climbed the porch hoping to introduce himself, and Bo promptly bloodied his nose. There was something about him that Bo didn't like. Turned out he was right. Bo liked to stay out all night, sleep in all day. He had a good left hook, a cauliflower ear, one blind eye, and the most bow-legged gait since Billy Crystal got off that horse in City Slickers. Frankly, Bo didn't have much to recommend. Worse, he didn't care. But he grew on you. He had lived upstairs in the old barn for God knows how long, and he considered it his own. Once, when I was moving lawn furniture out of there after the snow melted, and he more or less refused to move out of my way, I suggested he might make some sort of contribution if he hoped to stay. He tipped his head, stared at me with utter disdain, and resumed licking his paws. "Are you as dumb as you seem, Steve?" he seemed to say. My family considered him quite the charmer. They would pick him up and rock him like a baby, then scratch his chewed-up excuse for ears. When they began bringing him inside the house in summer, I was opposed, and loudly so. When I caught him sleeping under the kitchen table one day, I put my considerable foot down. "That old bag of bones barn cat is not moving into this house," I howled. "There's no telling where he was last night. This is a barn cat. He belongs in a barn." Pretty soon he had vacated the cardboard box in the haymow and taken up residence on a specially prepared lawn chair that had been moved to the back porch. It had a doubled-over, fluffed-up beach towel for a mattress and a parasol to shield Bo's scrawny frame from the sun. Truth to tell, though I railed against him for his arrogance and presumption, I worried a little when late autumn began to suggest winter. One day, obviously out of my mind, I stopped at a pet store and invested in one of those insulated igloo-style pet houses with a heavy-duty plastic flap for coming and going. Quote, "There's a nice blue mat that goes with it for another $15, said the sales lady. I was appalled. Do I strike you as a sort of sap who would spend another $15 to buy a bed for a shiftless barn cat that has slept on a pile of straw all his sorry life? I walked around the store feigning interest in bird feeders for 10 minutes, and then I forked over the extra 15 for the mat. I figured I'd get the big family points with the igloo. I put it on a bench on the porch and, with Bo lounging nearby, demonstrated how a grateful barn cat that had no visible source of income and relied on the kindness of strangers would go in and out, in and out. Bo took no notice. So I lifted him up and placed him inside. He promptly walked out. He did not walk back in. "I don't care if you paid $200 for the whole arrangement," he communicated quite clearly. "I'm not interested. I'm a cat, not an Eskimo." A week later, he was fast asleep in a laundry basket in the kitchen. A week after that, he had moved to the hallway upstairs. Soon, he was sawing logs on the end of our bed. I don't remember when he started sleeping between us. I came to admire his patience. He would waltz down for breakfast, and one of the kids would fill his bowl with crunchy cat food. He would look at it disdainfully, then stare at my wife, who was behind the morning paper. He was getting old, and his gums were getting sore, and he preferred something softer. In the end, Bo always got his way. A few weeks later, I noticed that he was struggling to make the leap from the floor to the bed, and that his trademark laziness had turned to listlessness. "He's got severe kidney problems," the vet pronounced. He's in an awful lot of pain. He should be put down." I was on a business trip to New York when I got the bad news. I don't know what came over me. I couldn't stop thinking about that old cat, how he was the picture of contentment when he slept, how he sauntered down the gravel drive from the barn like he owned the place, how he stared and glared until you got up and substituted smoked salmon for meow mix. When I arrived home, there was no Bo on the back porch, no Bo asleep on the stairs refusing to budge, no Bo in the bedroom taking the sun. After dinner that evening, I strolled out to the barn. I climbed the steps and walked over to the cardboard box that one of the kids had filled with straw when we first encountered that old cat. I stood and stared. Then, alone in that old barn, with not a soul in sight, you can bet I made sure of that, I had a good cry. I must be losing my edge.
Oh, thank you.